Hi everyone, I think we're about ready to get started here. Welcome, thank you all for coming. This session is about the Me Too movement, and we're going to unpack it a little bit, and then we're going to discuss how you guys can deal with sexual harassment situations in the workplace. It's my pleasure to introduce Rory Gerberg, who will be our speaker and facilitator of this session. Rory is a consultant on sexual harassment, bias, and diversity and inclusion at Ready Set, a diversity solutions firm that provides strategy, training, and recruiting services to help startups attract, retain, and grow diverse talent. Rory's work on gender and inclusion has spanned workplace sexual harassment, harassment on college campuses, and sexual violence in Latin America. Today, she revamps policies, advises leaders, and designs and runs workplace workshops to advance inclusive workplaces, working with organizations from small nonprofits to large tech firms. She's been featured in the New York Times, the Associated Press, NPR, and CBS This Morning. Let's welcome Rory.
You're at a normal day at work when that colleague of yours comes and asks you on a date again after you've said no multiple times. What do? You're out to dinner with a manager or someone higher up in your organization who compliments you on your blouse and how much it complements your figure, and then reaches under the table and strokes your leg. What do? You're at a holiday party or your company's holiday party, and a colleague begins telling you in graphic detail about their sexual exploits and shows you a vivid image on their phone. What do? Or you're on an email chain or a company chat, and a colleague makes a joke about women not really belonging in management. No one says anything. What do? These are some of the questions that we'll be answering today. Who has either themselves experienced or seen this happen to others in their workplace? I think I see every single hand minus one person in this room. This is something that is very familiar to our lived experience. And as we've increasingly seen in the news, this is an experience that we have and also need tools to respond. And so that's the goal of today, is really understanding what does Me Too or what does sexual harassment look like in the workplace, and how do we respond both on an individual level and on an organizational level. We won't cover everything. This is a 1-hour session, so unfortunately, we may not answer everything about sexual harassment, but the goal today is to give you more options. I'll start to go a bit faster, really, so we can get through a lot of material around what this problem is and how we can respond. I also won't be providing any clear-cut answers of this is what you always do, this is what you never do, because it's never that clear-cut. The reality is that every situation, every workplace is different. And the goal of today is to give you a framework for how you can understand how sexual harassment operates in the workplace and different options for you to respond. You, in that moment, will have to evaluate what's happening in your workplace, what you're comfortable doing, what the relationship is. This is to give you more tools to be able to move forward where you are. How am I in front of you today? As was mentioned, I do work with Ready Set, generally on diversity, equity, and inclusion in companies, and specifically around sexual harassment, looking at company policies and training, as well as a number of other elements. What brought me here after working on gender and post-conflict in Latin America is I was doing my graduate program at Harvard Kennedy School and had founded and was running a university-wide group to address the university's campus sexual assault and harassment program. And we had 4 points that we were advocating in the university policy. And when Harvard issued a new policy, it included 3 of those 4 points. So I thought, okay, this is great news. This is pretty good progress. Our work is close to done. Not so much. As I spoke to students, I heard, sexual harassment policy? We have a new sexual harassment policy? When did that happen? So this great new policy wasn't really creating change on the ground in people's day-to-day lived experiences. And that's what moved me from looking at policy to looking more holistically at how organizations and communities can solve and tackle sexual harassment in a holistic way, both top-down with policies and bottom-up with training and other initiatives. And then I moved into the workplace area where there are a lot of commonalities. My personal take is that workplace sexual harassment is not at all surprising because we socialize individuals without any sexual education in this country, so they don't learn healthy behavior or boundaries as adolescents. They go to university where there's a campus sexual assault epidemic, and then they enter the workforce, and surprise, surprise, we have workplace sexual harassment. So this is a really deep problem that is part of the trajectory of our lived experience. And now that we're here, we want to figure out how do we make change where we are and get new tools to solve this problem in the workplace. So to finish the introduction, write down a general 2 questions. One thing that you've learned about workplace sexual harassment, whether that's in your individual experience or through the last year as things have been increasingly prominent in the media, and one thing that you hope to learn today. Just write that down. And in a second, I'll get a few of your thoughts. So what have some people learned about sexual harassment at work? Just a couple quick thoughts.
So I wrote down that even people who think they're woke sexually assault and sexually harass because they don't know what the definition is necessarily.
So there's kind of a misalignment between intent and values and action.
Yep.
What else? Yeah.
That there's a really fine line between it being like actual sexual harassment than just kind of something trivial, because I remember when that girl wrote the article about her date with Aziz Ansari, a lot of people, there was like backlash saying that that's not actually sexual harassment, that's just a bad date, so there's a really like fine line.
Definitely. What did I see? Yeah.
It's really, really, really common, and power dynamics and like unequal power positions can often invite forms of harassment even where you wouldn't initially expect it.
I think it's getting better, but I think there is a certain stigma to it as well. When the Me Too movement came out, I was completely shocked at how many people I know that have been affected that I never had heard about before.
I think also, at least for me, part of it is like, well, this is just being a woman in today's society where like it's slowly changing, but like just a lot of the subtle things is also very related to just gender equity, and it's kind of like we just kind of like live with it, like sure, this is what happens.
So it's normalized, which may contribute to some of the stigma around coming out and saying it's a problem because this is just part of our lived experience.
I hope you can touch on this. It is very often not in the victim's best interest to do anything.
So let's move to the next question, which was, what do you hope to learn? And could you say what you hope to learn about that?
Situations where it was not in my best interest or to my colleagues' best interest to report an issue, concerns of backlash, and so how do we move forward from a situation where it's in the victim's best interest to stay quiet?
What I learned is that sometimes having policy processes or even people who are motivated towards stopping this kind of issues, that doesn't stop it from happening. So the second question you have, like how do we approach that situation at that point? Because you've kind of like taken, or your company has all the steps, let's say, to stop that, but it's still going on.
So kind of when there are the top-down structures that ostensibly should be solving sexual harassment, but it continues, how do we solve that? What else?
I would like to learn how to stop the internalized self-blame that a lot of survivors of sexual harassment or any really type of violence like go through, and how to best approach, this whole culture of blaming the victim, and how to, get just more strategies on like how to stop it internally, most importantly.
Very related to the question about reporting. Yeah.
Mine's more around how to properly educate, like within the workplace. So in my scenario, I'm in like a very small company and it's a lot of guy talk that's not necessarily like really bad, but it's kind of borderline, and it's like, okay, you can just tell it's out of ignorance. It's like, how do you just educate in the right way?
That is a big challenge that we will touch on. And then
how do you evaluate companies? When we graduate, we're all looking for somewhere to work. So from the outside, how can you decide if this is a culture that we think we would be comfortable in?
What do you do when you're stuck in an org? So I'm in a leadership role. I've had people bring things to me about senior leaders, have gone to senior HR, and then somehow, if something's going on at the executive level, that the repercussion process kind of gets stuck and gets sticky. And so like being the right advocate, being the right representative, when you don't know your ability to affect change.
Great. Well, I know that there are still hands because there are many things that we want to learn, and I want to make sure we start actually doing that learning. So let's jump in, and I'll start going relatively quickly so that we have time for Q&A. And feel free to jump in during the conversation for clarifying questions. Ideally, we'll be able to make it through. We'll start with, we're done with the introduction. We're going to move to digging deeper to understanding what sexual harassment is and how it functions, because that contributes to being able to solve some of the problems around reporting. If we don't understand what sexual harassment is, that can stop people from reporting, because they can say, oh, well, was that harassment? Was it not? It also helps us be able to step into educating others about what it is. If we understand it ourselves, often we stay silent because we don't feel we're able to really respond to questions that are asked of us. And then we'll look at tools to respond, both on an individual and an organizational level. So we had a couple comments about what you do if you're in a leadership position, or how you get it solved. Even if you have good leadership and good policies, what do you do at an organizational level to really change behavior? And then as an individual, what do you do when you're in the room and this happens? How do you navigate that interpersonal situation? And then lastly, we'll run over some scenarios to apply those tools to integrate our learning, and then have time for Q&A. So digging deeper. Today, we know that sexual harassment is and sex-based discrimination is the most common form of discrimination at work. This is the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal body that implements and enforces federal anti-discrimination laws. And as they've found, the most common complaints of harassment are based on sex. After that, race and disability, then age and national origin. And this crosses private and public sector. So it's a problem no matter what kind of organization you're in. How did we get there? This is a very detailed history of workplace Me Too. So we start in the 1800s. Maybe it started probably before then, but for our sake, where women have long been sexualized and dehumanized in different ways. And I will preface that I will speak about women because empirically we know that this is a gender dynamic. While this doesn't happen on a gender binary, statistically speaking, we know that women are more likely to experience harassment and men are more likely to engage in harassment. And so, but that does not mean that's the only type of harassment that will occur. It just facilitates my ability to explain these concepts to you. So women have long been experiencing objectification in various parts of our lives. We know that in education, on the street, in housing. And this is when we're talking about at work. Women increasingly entering the public workforce, we know often doing labor, unpaid labor at home, but as we're referring to it, the paid labor in the national economy. Really increasing with, who is this? Yeah, Rosie the Riveter, where we really had this image of, okay, let's join into the workforce. And as women were joining into the workforce, that didn't necessarily mean that they were entering in this position of power. They were often entering in at the secretary level, where we see on this cartoon, it says, "You're hired, Miss Olson, and may I escort you to our annual office picnic tomorrow?" So this we saw very commonly where women would enter at lower positions in the hierarchy and have a male boss in a position of power, where it was very prone to exploitation, where a man could easily say, sleep with me, or I will fire you. In the late 70s and 80s, we started seeing the term sexual harassment to describe women's lived experience in work. This was often going on, but that was the first time it was really introduced in legal scholarship and eventually became law and an illegal form of discrimination. Still, that didn't really make it into the social consciousness until 1991 with, who knows who this is or what this was? Awesome. The Anita Hill trial, where we had the confirmation hearing of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who during the hearings, Anita Hill testified to the harassment that she experienced by Judge Thomas. As we all know, that did not stop him from being elected to the Supreme Court. And so that gives us a sense of where what has been socially acceptable and not has ebbed and flowed. And then we fast forward, skipping a few things to today, where, as we know, the person of the year for times was those who are speaking out against Me Too. And now with social media, we see how prevalent of an experience is, how normalized this is. And that also leads us to ask, what do we do now? So what is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment is a form of discrimination based on sex or gender identity. The motivation is irrelevant. So it doesn't matter if it's actually based on sexual interest. It can't be, oh, well, I wasn't really interested, I just said that. And it's still sexual harassment. It can involve a target of any gender identity or sexual orientation. As I mentioned, of course, men can be harassed. Not many non-binary folks are harassed. It may involve a harasser of any gender identity or sexual orientation, and it may be same gender harassment. Yeah.
I just think the motivation is irrelevant. It's really interesting because a common response is that you should be flattered, but in reality, it's not presuming that this was actually based on interest, whether you reciprocate that or not. It's like there could be another reason why this action is happening, and so feeling flattered is like no part of the equation.
Exactly. And so as we see, this is part of why we went over the history, is because when we look at why workplace sexual harassment, we might think of part of how this is unique from other forms of the harassment that women experience throughout their lives. Is this is really where we're moving to individual autonomy and agency and economic dependency or independency. We know that a lot of other forms of violence against women, domestic violence, is perpetuated in situations of economic dependence. And so economic independence really matters for our career trajectories, for our ability to advance ourselves in our entire lives. And so it's a form of discrimination that impacts us irrespective of that sexual nature. There's research that there are cost to earnings. A really interesting longitudinal study was done that assessed women in their mid-20s who experienced sexual harassment had losses to income later in their lives, which was attributed to job change because people often leave a job rather than staying. And so that impacts our economic productivity. And sexual harassment is intersectional. So when we hear about sexual harassment and the women's movement generally, unfortunately, it's often discussed as a white women's problem. This is an intersectional problem for all identities. What we know is that for individuals of different backgrounds, sexual harassment is often racialized. So a woman may experience both race-based harassment and sexual harassment at the same time. There are also different impacts where, for Black women, for example, if the harasser is white, there is concern about racist backlash if she reports. If the harasser is Black, there's still concern about racist backlash for reinforcing a stereotype that she is also subject to. So there are unique dynamics that occur for women of different backgrounds. Types of sexual harassment. There are three main types of sexual harassment in the research and literature. We look at unwanted sexual attention, sexual coercion, and gender harassment. The first two are the ones that we tend to associate more with typical as sexual harassment. So unwanted sexual attention is pretty much what it sounds like, which is attention or conduct that is unwanted, unwelcome, or uninvited. That may be physical, it may be physical touching, it may be verbal, a suggestive comment, it may be a paraverbal of a certain gesture. Those are different forms of unwanted sexual attention. Sexual coercion is a subset of unwanted sexual attention, where it is unwanted sexual attention that is related to job benefits or threats. So that engaging in that sexual conduct is made a condition of someone's employment or a benefit of or promotion is offered if that conduct is engaged in. And so that could be an offering a promotion in exchange for sexual favors or threatening termination unless sexual demands are met. And the last is gender harassment. Gender harassment is when one insults, degrades, or expresses contemptuous attitudes about people of one's gender. So this may be gender bashing jokes, so men or women bashing jokes, comments that women don't belong in management or that men don't belong in child rearing activities, and sexual degrading words like calling someone a hussy or a male whore. So these are what we see generally is that when we look at what's in the news, we first saw the layer of sexual coercion. So Harvey Weinstein was a clear case of sexual coercion, of engaging in this behavior or else. Unwanted sexual attention is the second most recognized form of, even if there isn't a clear threat or benefit, it may also be sometimes more of an implicit thing, and that may not be related at all. But there are still very common unwanted sexual attention. And then gender harassment. What we look at is, when we look at the difference between the two, we can think of unwanted sexual attention and sexual coercion as kind of come-on harassment, where its interest is being expressed. Whereas gender harassment, we kind of think of put-down harassment. So this is putting down a group of people or an individual because of their identity in that group because of that identity. What is most common, actually, is gender harassment. The least common is sexual coercion, and in between them is unwanted sexual attention. How often does it occur? Between 25 and 85% of women experience sexual harassment at work. That is a pretty wide area. Any guesses as to why that's the case?
False and reporting.
Reporting. More or less exactly. Reporting in that it's related to how we identify something as and label it as this is harassment or not. So we heard at the beginning comments around, well, what's the fine line? Is this harassment? Is it not harassment? And oh, well, this is normalized. This is just part of women's lived experience. This isn't harassment. What happens between the 25% and the 85% is in the 25%, researchers are asking individuals, have you experienced sexual harassment? So I have to say, well, have I experienced sexual harassment? Yes or no. Versus the 85%, which tends to be the surveys that say, have you experienced this behavior? Have you been asked out multiple times after saying no? Have you gotten a compliment about your body at work? Right, exactly. Defines it as the behaviors, describes the behaviors that constitute the concept of sexual harassment without asking people to label it. So there's a huge gap. And also we know from the research that gender harassment is not always recognized even in the research. You have to look at who's doing research, who's getting research funding, because that's actually who controls how we get these numbers. And not everyone is recognizing gender harassment as a form of sexual harassment and accounting for it in their survey data. I love data. Public policy person. When we look at reporting, we also heard about how rarely it's reporting and how do we increase that? Well, exactly. Right now, we look at, of those who experience sexual harassment at work, only 10 to 30% are reporting. That means 70 to 90% are not reporting. And those are the individuals who are saying, yes, I have been sexually harassed, and no, I'm not going to report it. So how do we solve that? And that's what we'll move to now, of what do we do when sexual harassment occurs? How do we solve this problem by moving to understand what sexual harassment is, and then knowing what our options are, whether that's reporting, if that's what we choose to do and want to do and are empowered to then report, or also understanding what are our other options? What are the holistic set of options that we can, and actions we can engage in when sexual harassment occurs? So moving to tools to respond. There are tools at both an organizational and an individual level. At an organizational level, you can first revamp company policies. So companies should have sexual harassment policies. They may be in your company handbook. If your company is a startup or early stage and doesn't have a handbook yet, it should still have company policies, legally speaking, on sexual harassment or prohibited conduct. And there should be a consideration of concerns around sexual harassment throughout other policies. For example, what are the norms around how alcohol is consumed at work? What are the relationships that are considered appropriate and not appropriate? And so you can look at what are our company policies and are those sufficient? I do a lot of revisions of company policies, and in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about what policies should look like. Enforcing when incidents do occur. So it's great to have those policies, but what actually happens when an incident occurs? Making sure that there is a clear implementation as well as some level of transparency around what is happening in the org. So there is a guarantee of confidentiality to the extent possible in investigations. There is at the same time an importance to communicate with employees around that a certain issue has been addressed. And there are a lot of fine lines in that really depend on the situation. I work with a few clients in relation to how do you interact in this specific difficult situation. And training. So as we know, it's great to have these policies. We heard what happens, one of the questions earlier, my company has these great policies, ostensibly this should not be a problem anymore, but it continues to happen. If you've made the top-down changes where you have these new company policies and they're being enforced, then that's looking at what's the training that we really need to turn those company policies into a reality. And top-down leadership and management, taking it seriously, understanding how to respond when these instances occur, and also how to frame around it. Because if leadership doesn't clearly express that they believe it's a problem and should be taken seriously, neither will individual contributors, and it will continue to occur. For organizations, another digging a little deeper, there are specific risk factors that we know about that increase the likelihood that sexual harassment may occur in organizations. And so it's important to look at what is the operational context of your organization? Where might it be more likely that sexual harassment will occur? For example, when there's significant power disparities or a high-value employee. In both of those instances, there can be a sense that the harasser is immune from policies and will not be subject to enforcement, and indeed, companies are resistant to do so. That said, that's starting to change. Proximity to the office, when people are further from the office, it's more likely that sexual harassment will occur, and many other aspects. Happy to come back to this in the Q&A. Action tools to respond in your interpersonal experience. So when sexual harassment occurs when you're in the room or on the chat, there are various options that you have to respond. At a high level, you want to think about, who is it important that I talk to? Is it talking to the actual enactor of sexual harassment? And I use enactor and not harasser because when we say harasser, we have the barrier to, we can't even say harasser because we say, wait, was it harassment? Where they have right now, it's not important for you to categorize whether this is definitely harassment or not. This is an uncomfortable situation that looks like it may be sexual harassment. How do I take actions that will allow that to be addressed? And I'll let HR figure out whether it actually falls in the definition of sexual harassment that's prohibited. So addressing the enactor, that could be in person in the moment if you feel comfortable. It could be in a one-on-one afterwards. It might be that's more for a gender harassment situation where it's a lower level, and there might be something of, hey, I'm not sure you intended this, but, I'll get to some of the words that you can use in 1 second. First, continuing on the people that you can speak to. Seek peers and mentors. Often we know that sexual harassment doesn't happen in isolation. So if you are experiencing it, it is very likely that others are as well. I was just on site with a client yesterday who was sharing about an instance of harassment that was brought to their attention. They checked the company's Slack channel and found that the harasser had harassed multiple individuals at that company. And that we see that there are certain repeat offenders, as it's called in the literature. And it's not always the case, but if it's extreme, it may be happening. And so find out where else, if you can. That also helps you identify the nature of the problem and helps bring your case to HR if you decide that that's what is needed. Consult allies higher up in the organization. This can help identify what someone who understands the context, may have been there longer, may understand what the power structures in the organization are, how it's addressed. They may be able to help you think strategy of how you think through this response. Also, when you're seeking peers, take care of yourself. It really depends on what the type of harassment is. A lot of the time, these are things that can be very difficult. And as we know, we have a lived experience that we're bringing in to that experience of harassment. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself first and foremost and identifying what you need. Report to HR and keep records. If it's an extreme of severe harassment, it may be clearer that you want to report to HR, irrespective of whether it's clear that you want to report to HR now. Take steps to keep records because you never know what you'll decide later. And often, especially if it's a lower level form of sexual harassment or less intense, legally speaking, the more often that low form of sexual harassment occurs, the more problematic it is, the more the more likely it is to fall into the realm of illegal harassment. And so if you're documenting when it's happening, that's essentially providing the evidence to be able to make a case later. You also don't need to decide now whether or not you're going to bring a case. It can be also just a way of getting out what's going on and keeping track of that, so you can separate out your lived experience from your decision of what I want to do with that lived experience. Yeah.
And this is just a quick question in regards to peers and mentors, and I'm thinking of it with an HR hat as well. Obviously you have to trust the people that you're going to. Is there a risk, though, going to peers that additional, leakage can get spread? Or are you able to, do you recommend they go to HR and have a discussion just to see, do they, my question, it's basically like, when they go to HR, is that a final thing, they have to open a case? Or can they have that initial conversation to get kind of a feeling? Because I think I know for me, it can be such a gray area.
Yeah.
And that's where, so.
Yeah, so this is actually something that the short answer is it varies by company. And this goes into looking at action tools to respond, company policies. One of the big points that I constantly am pushing with companies is that the response should be proportionate to what has occurred. And so often it's difficult when companies have no tolerance policies or zero tolerance policies, because while the intent is great, that actually deters reporting and makes it more difficult for people to get assistance in this in-between zone. And so that is a question where you'll have to consult your policies, and if you're unsure about that, it's really a case-by-case basis. So moving to action tools to respond, and then we'll move to some Q&A and or scenarios, depending on which people prefer. So when you're in a conversation with someone who either themselves has engaged in harassment or has harassed another. So there's a lot of allyship behavior. When we think about harassment, the target of harassment tends to be in a position of lower power. And that's extremely challenging to be the one who is responding. And so I really, really encourage that when you see sexual harassment occur to your peers, that's the moment to step in and support them there and build that collective muscle so that they will do the same when it happens to you. First, express disapproval, being short, simple, and firm. So often there's the sense of, oh, I don't want to get into this long conversation, and what will I say, and oh, I don't want to overreact and make this too big of a deal. That's not necessary if you don't want to, and if you don't think it's appropriate for the context. Something as simple as a not cool or yikes, and moving on, indicating in a moment that that is not something that is socially acceptable in your workspace, in your social norms. 2, asking questions and engage in discussion. Kill them with curiosity. What did you mean by that? Could you tell me, wait, what was that joke? If they have to repeat themselves, and that also creates a space to really interrogate what are the assumptions that are being brought into that. Because then rather than you having to put in, this is what I think your assumptions are, you're actually pushing them to do that and ask that themselves. When it can create some defensiveness when we go in assuming someone's intentions. This also brings some real empathy into the conversation. I actually have done a lot of research on masculinity, and there is some fascinating things about the way that, we too often think about this as a women's problem. This is a men's problem, which actually goes to frame this as a man's problem, because it is. Because when we actually look at the way that who is engaging in this behavior, statistically speaking, it's mostly men. There was an interesting randomized control trial where researchers gave men two different tasks to, or gave men a choice of being able to braid a mannequin's hair or a rope, or they didn't give them a choice, sorry, they assigned them to braid hair. Either the hair was on a mannequin or it was just a rope, a thick rope. Then they gave participants an option to either do two tasks, put together a puzzle or punch a bag. Those who were assigned to braid the mannequin's hair were much more likely to choose punching a bag. And when both groups were instructed to then punch the bag, those who braided the mannequin's hair instead of the normal rope punched both harder and longer. Threats to manhood have real concrete impacts. And actually, they also measured their cortisol levels, and it actually resulted in an increase in cortisol. So there's a lot of physiology, a lot of psychology around what's happening. And that they're not aware of, and we're not aware, or no one, I'm being fair, all of us are unaware of what's really happening. And so there's really an opportunity for learning. Avoid humor because while we often do it because we don't know how to respond, it can implicitly allow for that behavior to continue. So if you know that you tend to use humor because you don't know what else to say, I completely understand. I did it for a long time as well. Think about humor. If you're using it, use it strategically. It is uncomfortable to think about, how am I going to go from silence, where I don't speak up at all, to making a strong statement? That's really uncomfortable, and I don't know how to navigate that interpersonal dynamic. Well, think about using humor as a way to get to one to the other. Of the next time something comes up, making a joke that indicates it's not socially acceptable. If you need to, a second time. After the third time, then you've already established an expectation that you don't think that's socially acceptable, and it's much easier for you to have a more serious conversation or make a non-funny comment of yikes or not cool, because, hey, don't you kind of get the idea? I already expressed this. And lastly, advocate for the values you're supporting. It's often challenging to talk about what you're going against, and that really puts you into the defense. Frame the values that you're going for and look at your company values. Be tailored in saying, okay, which company values are most associated with what it looks like to respect people or all individuals at work. So, tools on both an individual level and organizational level. On the individual level, addressing the actor, seeking peers and mentors, consulting allies, higher up, reporting to HR and keeping records, and on an organizational level, revamping company policies, enforcing those policies when incidents do occur, providing training to staff, and making sure that leadership and management is both modeling behavior and taking these incidents seriously when they do occur. Given our time, we can do scenarios if anyone wants to stay after time, but let's move to Q&A to look at all these fun scenarios we would have done if this. And our workshop is just, these are big issues. And so what I generally do is I'll have room to apply this. But why don't we have a couple Q&A before we close, and then if there are individuals that want to stay after and do one scenario, I'm happy to do that.
As I perceive it, your definition and stuff of sexual harassment is a legal definition, is what's coming from the law. Do you generally think, or the way you work with companies, think that they should be trying to follow the law, or that they should be doing something better?
Great question. So this definition, just to clarify, is a non-legal definition.
Okay.
Legally speaking, sexual harassment is only sexual harassment when it is either severe or pervasive. The definition that I'm using here is when one instance of sexually harassing behavior occurs, we want to address it. We don't need to wait until it's pervasive to address that problem. And that's exactly what I advocate for companies, is that company policies should go above the legal baseline. The law is a baseline. It is not, because when the government is enforcing it, that's the state taking away life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of their citizens. This is a company where it's a privilege to work there, not a right. And they have the ability, and they should be ensuring that their standard of behavior is a higher line, and they should be addressing any instance, because what a company wants to do is address an instance after it's 1, 2, or 3 times, not wait until it's 7, 8, 9 times to be able to come in and address it. Yeah.
And I'm so glad you said that. I think so much of what I was trained on early in my career was the legal definition. And it seemed so hard to prove that, you were passed up for a promotion, or, and I think that's where a lot of the gray started, because people think it has to be this exaggerated instance, but it really can be just as simple, like when you were saying, boys in the workplace, or a simple conversation. So I think that was thank you for clarifying that. I think that helps a lot.
Other questions?
I don't remember what industry it was, but there was a thing in the news where women were just privately keeping like an Excel file of all the dirtbags. Does anybody remember this?
Like the news industry.
Okay, so the news industry, they were just writing down, hey, avoid this guy after like 5 p.m. or whatever. So knowing that there's such high instances of underreporting of sexual harassment, I get that that's not ideal, but what do you think of that as a solution, and does that fit in with overarching goals of like changing behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is meeting people where they're at rather than where we might want them to be. The way that I do this work is very much based in where people are at and filling the gap, but meeting them there. And I think that right now, what we know about the lack of reporting is for a good reason. This is unfortunate, but the research does show there are very high rates of retaliation despite it being illegal. And so until we actually solve that problem and genuinely make it a feasible and safe option to report without retaliation, without threat to our economic predictability and our career trajectory, we need to figure out what makes sense with what do I do now given the concerns that I have. And if that's one way to be able to engage in advancing your career, then that's necessary. Another thing that's important for is this is in the context, mostly, we've had to narrow the discussion because this is 1 hour, we've been talking about when it happens within a company. Given the change in our economy and the way that labor very quickly transitions from one company to another, that means that informal networks are increasingly important, where we might not be able to go to HR or have an organization that could come in. We have to navigate that interpersonally. And so that's where you want to think about, okay, what tools top down do I have, and when I don't have them, how do I navigate this? I'll take 3 and then respond to them all at once.
So I feel like with the Me Too movement, there's been a little bit of a backlash from men, and like good men, because I've heard, from different men are like, now I don't want to come close to a woman, or now I'm so afraid if I'm nice to her, she's going to report me for sexual harassment. And I've even heard this from male colleagues and friends as well. And it kind of came to my attention too when last weekend a guy was like, are you going to be mad at me if I hold the door open for you. So I'm wondering, like, what do we do about this? You know, like, how do we keep fighting our fight, but not alienate the good men who are not going to sexually harass us, but now are afraid to even be nice to us?
Fantastic question. I want to just take 2 more really quickly and do all of them.
Well, mine actually piggybacks off what you were going to say. Is some of the backlash that I've heard against the Me Too movement is men saying, well, now anyone can just say that a guy has, or any woman can come out and say that some guy has harassed her and now his career is doomed. You know, like anyone can come out and just say anything, and that's like a backlash. I was wondering what your thoughts are against that and how to respond to that.
Yeah, my question is actually similar, but in the sense that like now also men aren't helping women advance in their careers because then they don't go out to lunch with them, they don't really advocate for them, and they don't really push them up for promotions because they're scared again of that backlash. So I was wondering like also like how can men help women further their careers and still do the lunch things and the coffee things without being scared.
So 2 things with those fantastic questions and comments. One is engaging in empathy when we're speaking to men, because as I mentioned before, we have socialized men to engage in this behavior. Like, we in this room can talk about what they're engaging, and at the same time, we also need to talk about why they're engaging in those behaviors and what social media, what pornography has done to fill the gap in the lack of sex education that we have in this country, and how that perpetuates these interactions. And so this is actually not a surprise. And actually asking and learning about your male colleagues and how they've learned their masculinity, for me, that has been a fascinating exercise. Learning about how other men have learned what it means to be a man. Did they learn it by going to strip clubs with their father? Did they learn it by telling about their sexual exploits and joking about that? That there is a lot that we actually don't know, and I think that as we learn that, we can engage in a way that has more empathy, where we're able to hold both, as you talked about, of holding, this is complex. There is a real difficult lived experience on both sides, both for men and for women in this gender binary. And so how do we hold both of those together? And the second aspect, as far as how we deal with that backlash of this fear of retaliation. So that's where it's moving from moving into saying this is not about that any man can, oh, I just slipped and I harassed you, right? Like that's not what we're saying. It's how do we have a conversation about what behaviors mean respect in the workplace? There was a blog a while ago that I loved the metric that she used of men treat your female colleagues as if they are the Rock Johnson. So the Rock, the wrestler, the like big, like buff wrestler, imagine that all of your female colleagues are the Rock. Like, if The Rock wore a nice blouse today, would you be like, hey, The Rock, that really compliments your figure? Probably not so much. You'd probably be afraid of getting squished. So how do we just engage in that different behavior and really say it's not about that anything can be sexual harassment. It's just how do we re-look at what it means to treat women respectfully and not as objects in the workplace. And lastly, I will stay for any additional questions that you have, but I would hugely appreciate if you want to take a picture of this or fill it out now. If you're able to fill out this Google form, that really helps me as I iterate and improve. And it's a very short, just couple minutes with a few questions on what you learned and what you would improve. And feel free to get in touch. As I said earlier, I'm at the Ready Set doing both consulting and training for companies. So if that seems needed at your company, let me know. Thanks so much.